I used to think honesty was the one thing that separated me from every woman who smiled through a marriage that was quietly killing her. I told myself I was too real for the performance, too alive for the kind of love that just runs on routine. I said it out loud sometimes, to friends, to Daniel, to anyone who seemed like they could handle a woman who knew her own nature. What I did not expect was how quietly a man could listen, and how thoroughly he could prepare. By the time I sat down in that mediation room and saw the petition on the table with his name and my name, and a date 3 weeks in the past, the only person in that building who was surprised was me. My name is Claire Morrow. I am 34 years old, and I work as a marketing strategist at a mid-sized brand agency where I am, with very few exceptions, the sharpest person in any room I walk into. I have never seen much use in performing modesty about this. I read people quickly. I find the angle that makes something feel necessary, and I arrive at most situations with a clear sense of how they are likely to end. What I have never been very good at is staying still long enough to let a good thing simply be good without needing to confirm it was still there. Daniel and I had been married for 5 years when this story begins. He was a corporate attorney, recently made partner at a litigation firm, careful and systematic in the way some people are careful and systematic, not through effort but through basic architecture. He showed love through competence. Better apartment, cleared weekend, problem converted into plan. Every Sunday morning he made my coffee with too much sugar. I told him about the sugar once in the first year, and he nodded, and made it exactly the same way the following Sunday. I never corrected him again. For 4 years I drank it wrong, and somewhere in the middle of those years the wrongness became the most reliable thing in my week. On mornings when he had already left for the office before I came downstairs, the cup was still on the counter, wrong in the same quiet way, and I missed it before I finished it. He also arrived at my punchlines early. He laughed before I finished my jokes because he had been listening closely enough to know where I was going. That kind of attention is rarer than people acknowledge, and I stopped noticing it approximately 1 year before I needed to notice it most. Our building had a rooftop terrace with 2 chairs. His was pulled slightly forward toward the railing. Mine sat a little behind it. We had never discussed this arrangement. It had settled in over time, the way most arrangements settle, without anyone deciding. One evening over dinner he asked, gently, whether I had seemed quieter lately, or whether he was misreading the room. He said it without pressure, just as a question that mattered to him. I said I was tired. He said he wanted to make sure things were good between them. I said things were fine. He went back to his food. He had asked what had changed. I had answered something else. A few days later he tried again, smaller this time, while we were getting ready in the morning. He said he had felt a distance he could not quite place, and he wanted to know if he was doing something differently than before. I said everything was fine, and said it cleanly enough that he had nothing to hold. He said okay. He folded the shirt in his hands. He believed me, or he chose to, which in practice produced the same result. That Friday, I accepted a charity gala invitation for the following week. Daniel had a client dinner. I accepted alone. I changed outfits 3 times before leaving, and when he said from the bedroom doorway that I looked fine after the first choice, I understood he could not see what I was looking for in the mirror and changed anyway. The silver lighter I had bought at a weekend vintage market 3 years earlier, small, engraved, beautiful for no functional reason, kept in my purse as something to produce at parties that gave people a reason to start a conversation, was sitting on the nightstand. I picked it up on the way out and put it in my bag. I had no particular reason. I just took it. The gala was at a hotel on the east side, mezzanine level, 200 people performing generosity in a room designed to reward the performance. I arrived at 7 and moved through it the way I know how to move through rooms, present, directed, making people feel briefly seen so they remember the feeling warmly and want to stay in the vicinity. The speaker was earnest, and the food was better than last year, and the woman from the city council wore heels that disagreed with the parquet floor and spent the evening travelling carefully between table edges. The event photographer was working from near the entrance, moving through groups quickly, documenting tables and speeches and the ambient texture of the room. Then he stopped moving quickly. He found me near the window side and adjusted his position twice before he took the first shot, and afterward he lowered the camera and came over and said I had very precise energy. Hard to frame correctly, but worth the effort of trying. His name was Marcus Reeves. He was 38 years old. He worked in events and editorial commissions and portrait work for clients who could afford to be documented with care. And he looked at me the way a person looks at something they are deciding whether to take seriously, directly, without hurry, working toward yes. I stayed on his side of the room for most of the evening. He photographed me twice more before midnight, adjusting the angle each time until he found the version of me that worked. I understood what he was doing and I stayed still for it. I told myself this was a conversation. Conversations were honest. Being honest about your own nature was not the same as doing something wrong. I drove home at 11. Daniel was in the living room with a book, not waiting exactly, but present in the easy way of someone who trusted where things stood. He asked about the evening, the venue, the speaker, the crowd. I gave him nearly all of it. I described the food, the wrong shoes, the city council woman, the speech. I did not mention Marcus. The gap between what I said and what had actually happened was small enough to step over, and I stepped over it, and I noticed doing it, and I kept going. 2 days later, I collected Daniel's shirts from the dry cleaning service in the building lobby. Fluorescent light, numbered plastic tag, 4 shirts pressed and arranged correctly in a white bag. I carried them upstairs and hung them in his wardrobe where the cedar smell lived. And I stood there with the door open for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the row of his things spaced evenly the way he spaced everything, without thinking about anything I could specifically name. I closed the wardrobe. I texted Marcus. On Tuesday, Daniel came home to learn, from the other husband, that I had cancelled a dinner the 4 of us had planned together. He came into the kitchen with his jacket still on and asked me, using their names specifically, what had happened to change the plan. He said it had been on the shared calendar for 2 weeks, and he wanted to understand the change. He kept his voice even and direct. He said when plans shifted without a conversation between them, the shared calendar became unreliable, and that their home ran on reliable information, and that he had been made to feel like an outsider in his own schedule by learning about the change from another man. He offered to rearrange the following Saturday entirely so they could reschedule and make it right. I said I had not been in the mood and was not aware that moods required advance filing. He said he was not asking about moods. He was asking why someone else had to inform him of a change in his own week. He said if something was bothering me, he wanted to know what it was. I said the problem, if he was determined to frame it as a problem, was precisely that he converted every emotional subject into a scheduling conversation, and that the exchange happening right now was a perfect demonstration of that gap. He looked at the counter between us, at the space where what he had asked and what I had answered did not meet, and said he was going to take a shower. He had asked a real question. I had answered a different one. Neither of us said this out loud. He came back 3 evenings later with a second, quieter question. He said the building's front door key code log had shown the entry opening past midnight on 3 specific evenings. He named each date, and that he was not tracking me, but he wanted to know if everything was all right at Simone's, since that was where I had said I was. He asked it the way he asked things he had already organised in his own head, neutral, factual, without accusation. He said he wanted both of them to feel safe in their own home, and that knowing where the other person was had always been part of that. I told him I was 34 years old and not obligated to reconcile my movements with the building's key code system. He said he understood. He was not asking for a report. He was asking if everything was all right. I said it was fine. He said he was glad. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and did not raise the subject again that evening. He had been right about 2 of the 3 dates. Simone's apartment that Saturday afternoon. I told her about Marcus, the version that sounded like freedom rather than a sequence of choices I had already made. And she asked once carefully whether I was certain this was what I wanted. I said I was not doing anything wrong. I said admitting honestly what I was had more integrity than maintaining a performance for a man who had stopped being curious about who I actually was, and she agreed before I finished the sentence. She said she could cover for me if I needed her to. Her boyfriend Paul came through twice with coffee. I said no both times without fully looking at him. That same evening I recorded a voice note for Marcus, a time, an address, a small joke about Daniel's predictable schedule that was funnier if you knew both people. I pressed send. I looked at my screen and understood, with a specific cold clarity, that I had sent it to the group thread, the one that included both Simone and Paul. I called Simone within 60 seconds. She said she would handle Paul, that he barely paid attention to that thread, that it was going to be fine. I said I knew. I believed her because I needed to. 3 weeks passed without consequence. Then Simone called on a Wednesday morning in a voice that was a half-tone too carefully arranged to be her natural voice. She said Paul had been asking specific questions about something he heard, not general questions, particular ones about the address and the date. She said she was handling it. I told her to tell him it was context-dependent humour, nothing behind it. She said she had already tried that. I called Marcus. He told me to stay calm. I found this entirely unhelpful. I put the phone down and found the silver lighter in the bottom of my bag and held it for a moment without purpose, and put it back. Daniel's firm held its annual client appreciation evening at the Hotel Meridian, ballroom level, the last Thursday in October. 140 guests, senior partners, client families, associated professionals, and 12 people who knew both of us well enough to talk about us later. I knew Marcus had been booked as the event photographer. This was not coincidence. I had mentioned the event to him weeks earlier, and he had mentioned doing corporate events, and I had not discouraged the connection. Neither of us had put the arrangement into words, but neither of us was confused about it. I arrived at 6:45 before Daniel. He was finishing something at the office and would join by 8. I used the hour to be the version of myself that fills a room correctly, louder than usual, sharper than usual, generating the specific energy that keeps a party from going flat. 3 colleagues from my agency were there as guests, and I could see them watching me from across the room with the careful attention of people who are trying to name something they cannot quite locate. Marcus photographed me twice in the first 40 minutes, not as event documentation but as himself, adjusting the angle each time until he found the right one. We both understood this and neither of us pretended otherwise. Daniel arrived at 8:15. He came through the ballroom entrance and found me near the photography station and saw Marcus before he had fully crossed the room. He had encountered Marcus once before, at an industry party 3 months earlier, briefly and without context. Now the context arrived, and I watched the file open and close in his face in the space of about 4 seconds. He said nothing. He crossed to where I was standing and touched my back once in greeting. I moved a half step forward, not dramatically, just enough to make clear to the room that I was not a woman who needed to be claimed at a party. This was deliberate. I knew it was deliberate. One of my agency colleagues asked, smiling, whether the photographer had been following me around all evening. I laughed and said that Marcus understood the difference between attention and possession, and that this was something my husband had not entirely worked out. The group response was uncertain. One laugh, then quiet. I turned to Daniel and said directly that he should not look at me the way he was looking at me. I said that a man who went to the office 8 nights out of 10 had no standing to watch me from across a room at a party as though I was something he had misplaced. I said that being faithful to him felt like wearing a uniform that had never been cut in my size. I said this with a smile, because the truest things land softer when you deliver them lightly. He was standing 4 feet away. His managing partner was standing 6 feet behind him. Daniel set his glass on the nearest high table. He placed it carefully, as if the placement mattered, precisely in the center of the surface. He said he was going to speak with the Hartwell clients for a moment and excused himself to the far side of the room. His managing partner watched him cross and then looked back at the table and said nothing. I told my colleagues that Daniel was constitutionally unable to argue with honesty, and so he removed himself from it whenever it arrived. The group was quieter than it had been 30 seconds earlier. I did not register this change in temperature. Near the bar, someone asked for a light. I produced the silver lighter from my purse. The cigarette was lit in 2 seconds, but Marcus was there with the camera and he caught it. Lighter in my hand, silver catching the flash, my face above it in the arrangement he had been working toward all evening. He showed me the image on his camera screen afterward. I looked in that image exactly like the most interesting subject in the room. That is exactly how I felt. For 3 seconds, watching Daniel's back as he crossed the ballroom, something settled in my chest with a weight I did not want to name. I reached for a fresh glass from a passing tray, looked at Marcus, spoke to the people nearest me, and told myself it was the warmth of the room. It was not the warmth of the room. But I put it somewhere it would not be visible, and that was close enough. The crowd thinned toward 10. Daniel found me near the exit and said he had arranged for me to take the car home, that he had a few things still to finish. His voice was normal. His face was something I had not seen before. Not cold, not angry, but settled in the way a face settles after a decision has been made and the deciding is finished. He kissed my cheek once and went back into the room. He called while the car was still moving. I declined. He called again. I declined again. The third time I answered and he asked, in the same measured voice, whether I had arrived home safely. I said not yet. He said he would be an hour. He asked if they could talk when he got back. I said fine. He came home and sat at the kitchen table and asked what I had meant by the uniform comment. He said he needed to understand whether this was something that had been building for a long time or whether it was the room and the wine. He said he was not angry. He was asking because the answer mattered. He said he wanted to know if there was something specific he had failed to give me that he could still try to give me now. I said he was asking in the wrong way, which meant he had already missed the point. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said he wanted both of them to sleep in the same apartment and try again tomorrow. I said that was fine. We went to bed. The cedar smell from his wardrobe was very close in the dark. I knew that what he had asked at the kitchen table was a real question, and that I had deflected it, and that he knew I had deflected it. The lighter was on the nightstand again. I had taken it out of my bag without thinking about it. It felt heavier than I remembered buying it. Sunday dinner at Patricia's house, Daniel's mother's home, which I had been entering for 6 years and had never felt fully settled in. Not because she was unkind, but because she was precise, and precision in people I cannot charm makes me uncomfortable in a specific way I do not enjoy examining. 8 of us at the table. Daniel and me, Patricia, Daniel's younger brother and his wife, and 2 family friends who had known Daniel since before he had a wife to bring to dinners. I had been warm all week, warmer than usual, in a way I could measure against the baseline. I made coffee one morning and left it where he would find it. I asked about a case he was working on and listened to the full answer. I complimented his suit. I texted him once midday, a reference to a private joke from an early year that I knew would land exactly right. I told myself this was not strategy. I told myself I was simply being present, and that being present would correct the atmosphere that had been building since the hotel evening, and that once the atmosphere was corrected, I could continue with everything else. I believed this reasoning while I was using it. The warmth was a layer I was applying, and I applied it carefully, and he received each gesture with the quiet, organized neutrality of a man who was cataloguing information without reacting to it. At the dinner table, I was pleasant and easy, and I told a story about a difficult client that made the family friends laugh. Somewhere near the main course, I made a comment about how some people chose traditional lives, and there was a kind of clarity in that. A beautiful simplicity, even if it was not something I would choose for myself. I said it in the general direction of the table, the way you say something you want to sound like an observation when it is actually a position. Patricia set her fork down. She said very quietly that she hoped Daniel was happy. She looked at him when she said it, not at me, not at the table, directly at her son. Daniel said he was fine. Patricia said she knew. There was an entire conversation in those two exchanges between them, in a register I was not part of. I asked Patricia about the garden renovation she had mentioned in the spring, and she answered pleasantly, and the dinner continued. But what had passed between them stayed at the table for the rest of the meal. That night, I passed Daniel's home office on my way to the bedroom. The door was half open. He was sitting at his desk with nothing open on the screen, not working, not reading, not doing anything visible. Just sitting in the particular stillness of a person holding something too heavy to put down. The room was dim. I stood in the doorway for 3 or 4 seconds, and I had the specific impulse to go in, to pull the other chair around, to sit across from him, to say nothing specific and simply be there. The moment stayed open for those 3 or 4 seconds, and then it closed and I walked to the bedroom. I told myself later I was giving him space. I was not giving him space. I was afraid that if I sat down, he would tell me something that could not be untold. I described this to Simone 2 days later and said Daniel was performing sadness, that he went quiet and waited for me to come to him and manage the situation, and that this was a pattern she had heard me describe before, and that I had no interest in being the emotional regulator for a grown man who had chosen to sit alone in a dark room rather than have a real conversation. Simone said something careful and neutral. Paul was in the next room and the door was thin. That same week, Simone called on a Thursday with a voice that was working hard at being casual. She said Paul was still asking questions about the voice note, specific questions now about the address and the dates. She said he had been sitting on the recording for weeks and was talking about it with someone she did not name. I told her to tell him again that it was a joke without context, nothing that meant what it sounded like. She said she had told him that twice. I called Marcus. He said I needed to stay calm and that he was not going to be reachable for a few days. I found both pieces of information unhelpful. 2 days after that, I went to the Home Office to retrieve a folder from the shared desk drawer we had both used for working documents. The folder was gone. Everything on my side of the drawer was there, exactly as I had left it. Everything on his side, the calendar organizer, the slim folder with the firm's name on the tab, the 3-year tax folder they kept together, was gone. I checked his briefcase by the door. It was locked, which it had never been in 5 years of living in that apartment. I stood in the doorway for a moment and told myself he had moved things to the office for a work reason. I almost convinced myself. Almost. He came home that evening and I told him, in the kitchen, that I wanted things to be better between them. I said I had not been easy to be around lately and I wanted him to know I was aware of that. He looked at me for a moment and then said he appreciated me saying so. He asked if I wanted to talk about what had been happening between them. I said I did not think I could explain it yet, but that I wanted him to know I was trying. He said he was glad. He made tea and offered me a cup. I accepted. We sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes and talked about something else entirely, and I told myself the warmth was working, and he sat across from me with the organized quiet of a man who has already made certain decisions and is not going to tell you about them yet. Marcus's studio in the North Quarter, industrial space, high windows, afternoon light that was very good for faces. I was there on a Thursday when I should not have been. He photographed me against the white wall with the city visible through the glass behind me. He showed me the image on his screen. I looked composed in it. In the long studio mirror beyond him, I looked like someone who had been moving fast for a long time and was performing stillness. He mentioned a rooftop party the following week. Vance Hotel. He said I should come. I said I would think about it. I already knew I was going. The Vance Hotel rooftop was high and open, city in 3 directions. The kind of view that makes any conversation feel brief and temporary. 35 people, photographers, editors, 2 event producers, and 3 women whose names I heard and did not retain. I arrived at 9 in the version of myself that travels lightest. No history, no context, nothing that needed managing. Marcus introduced me to people throughout the evening, and each time he started, I finished the introduction myself. I said my name, my work, and then a phrase I had not planned but which felt, the first time I said it, like the most accurate description of my current situation. Mostly single. I said it lightly, as a statement of fact, with a slight smile that suggested I found my own honesty entertaining. I said it 7 times in 45 minutes to 7 different clusters of people. By the time the evening thinned, the phrase had its own circulation. Near the end of the evening, I took 1 photo from the railing, city behind me, lights below, my face above all of it, and posted it to my account with the caption finally breathing. Daniel followed my account. I knew this when I posted it. I told myself I was posting it for myself, that it was documentation of an evening and nothing more, that saying a true thing in public was not the same as directing it at someone. I put my phone away and did not check for responses for 25 minutes, and then checked. The next morning he was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. 1 cup on the counter, his. He asked how the Vance Hotel rooftop had been. I said it was good, relaxed, a nice crowd. He picked up his phone from the counter and set it face up between us, the posted photo visible on the screen, the caption underneath it. He asked, without raising his voice, whether the phrase mostly single was a joke or a statement of how she understood her current situation. I said things at parties and not all of them required a formal annotation. He set the phone down and asked me directly whether I wanted this marriage to continue. He said he needed to know that specific thing, not what I was feeling, not what I meant by any phrase, just whether I wanted the marriage to continue. He said if I told him honestly that I did, he would stop what he had already started arranging, and they would try. 1 condition only, that she would tell him the truth, directly and with him, rather than performing it for other people, in other rooms. He looked at me across the counter and was very still. He had the lighter way of asking that question, the way that lands harder than volume. I said he was asking me to be a different person. I said his phrase, what he had already started arranging, told me everything about how he saw me, which was as a situation requiring administration. I said that was precisely what I had been describing for 3 years, and that a woman who was honest about her nature was not the same as a woman who was unmanageable, and that he had never been able to tell the difference between those 2 things. He picked up his coffee. He picked up his keys. He said, very quietly, that he would handle things properly, and that he had already spoken to someone, and that she would hear from him this week about next steps. He said next steps in the voice he used in depositions, neutral, future tense, already decided. He left. The door did not slam. I stood in the kitchen for longer than I meant to. I opened the photo I had posted and looked at myself in it, city behind me, lighter not visible but in my jacket pocket, the caption underneath. I looked very certain of myself. I looked very alone. I closed the app without reading the comments. He called once at noon and once at 3. I let both go. At 4:30, a calendar notification arrived on my phone. An invitation from a mediation firm for a session the following week, subject line listing both our surnames. I assumed Daniel had found a formal route to couples counselling through the correct channels, which was entirely consistent with how he operated. I accepted the invitation. I did not read the attached document. There was a case number at the top of the attached document. I did not see it. The mediation office was in a glass building on the south side of the city, neutral surfaces and careful lighting. The kind of building where every detail communicates that what happens inside it is serious. I arrived 3 minutes early, dressed the way I dress for presentations, assembled above the occasion, in control of everything visible. Daniel was already seated in the conference room. He stood when I entered. He did not touch me. The mediator was a woman in her mid-50s with the specific professional neutrality of someone who has heard every version of every possible story and stopped being surprised by any of them. She placed a document on the table in front of my chair. I read the heading. I read it a second time. I asked if this was what I thought it was. She said yes. The divorce petition had been filed 3 weeks earlier. Temporary financial and property orders already attached. The first hearing was 6 weeks out. At the bottom was a delivery confirmation with my own signature. The signature I had given the building concierge for an envelope I had taken inside, assumed was from building management, left on the kitchen counter for a week, and recycled with the other mail without opening. I did not say this out loud. The mediator described the documented basis. A voice recording obtained through a mutual acquaintance, time-stamped social media posts including the Vance Hotel rooftop from the previous week, and a written statement from a family member regarding a pattern of behavior over 18 months. The family member was not named. I knew immediately. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the document on the table. In the lobby afterward, a woman was seated near the entrance with a phone and the stillness of someone who was exactly where she had planned to be. She stood when Daniel came through the conference room door. He said her name, Eleanor, and said mine, and said she was a colleague, which was technically true, family law attorney, opposing counsel on several of his firm's cases over the past 2 years. She said it was nice to meet me. The lobby was very bright. I understood 3 things simultaneously and said nothing about any of them. I used to believe that telling the truth about your own nature was a form of integrity, that a woman who named what she was had more dignity than one who smiled through a life she had not chosen. What I understand now with a precision that is no longer useful is that I was not telling the truth. I was performing honesty for an audience. The audience has gone home. The performance ended some time ago. I did not know it was ending. I thought I was the one deciding when it ended. I was not. The silver lighter was at the bottom of the 3rd moving box. I had not packed it deliberately. It was just there. Closure snapshot. 3 mutual friends stopped responding to her messages within 2 weeks of the filing becoming known through a mutual acquaintance. The joint investment account remained frozen through proceedings. She cancelled 2 subscriptions and forgot a 3rd until the charge came through. Marcus sent 1 message 11 days after the filing. He said he cared about her but had not agreed to this, and went quiet. His photography page was active again within the month. Her agency's largest client, introduced through Daniel's firm's network, transferred their account to another agency without a formal explanation. Her manager called her in for a check-in and asked how things were going outside of work, in the tone of someone documenting that she had asked. She moved into the 1-bedroom apartment on Crane Street over a single weekend. On clear mornings, she could see the building they had shared from her kitchen window. She did not move the box with the lighter.